I want to compare and contrast the disciples of John the Baptist with the disciples of Jesus. And we're going to find that they're very different, very, very different. John's disciples aligned themselves with the Pharisees, and then write this down, they became critical of who God is reaching. And in verse 30, it says, Pharisees and the scribes began grumbling at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with the tax collectors and the sinners?" So the sinners would be the immoral people or the irreligious people. And there would be a number of women there at that party, but they were not the good synagogue-looking girls that you might think from the good synagogue. And you knew they were sinners by the way that they dressed, and some of those, they had some very bad reputations. And some of those people there at that party might be using language that John's disciples would never use. I don't think Jesus' disciples would ever use, except for that one time that Peter did, but they would never use that language. And what you notice is that does not appear to be an issue for Jesus or the disciples, his disciples, but it's a big issue for the disciples of John. They don't want to reach those people, those kinds of people. So not just critical of who God is reaching, John's disciples will also be critical of how God is reaching people. It says, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? So John's disciples would say, that's not how we reach people. That's not how John reached people. How did John reach people? Well, John went out into the wilderness. He went out into the wilderness and he preached. And when he preached, people would just show up. And if they wanted truth, they knew where to find it. But we didn't go to them. They came to us. And we didn't make it convenient either. And John would never go into the city, into people's homes and preach. He would always stay out, and if they wanted it, they had to go out there and they had to find John. Well, okay, that's the method that God was using back then, but now he's using a different method. Jesus is eating with them. John would never do that. So it's going to be the same message, but it's going to be a different method. But the disciples of John, they could never make the jump. They could never make the jump. Well, also interesting, John's disciples equated spiritual maturity with misery. Spiritual maturity with misery. So I put it there from Mark's gospel. It says, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. They know it's a party, but they show up fasting. That is, they're not eating. They think, well, if everyone is fasting, or if everyone is feasting, then we're going to be really spiritual and we're going to be fasting. We're not going to eat anything. So why did they do that? Well, they had equated that spiritual maturity meant misery. They went together. And so now they are fasting, but they should be feasting. Now, interesting, for Matthew, coming to Jesus was something to celebrate, not commiserate, but not for the disciples of John. They didn't see coming to Jesus as a celebration. I can't help but wonder how many people have stayed away from Jesus because someone who claimed to be a disciple of Jesus, when they described what spiritual maturity would look like, it looked a lot more like misery than a celebration. And sadly, looking a lot more like the disciples of John. Always remember that Matthew meets Jesus and he throws a party. Jesus and his disciples enjoyed the party. But it was John's disciples, not Jesus's disciples, that equated spiritual maturity with misery. Well, verse 33 on your outline, it says, they said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours, Jesus, yours go on eating and drinking. Now that's interesting because the word there for drinking is the word pino, which just means to imbibe. And every serious Bible scholars would say they were having wine at the party. They were having wine. So much so that in Luke chapter 7, just 2 more chapters when we get there, Jesus is going to say, the Son of Man has come eating and drinking. And you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Then he says, yet wisdom is justified by all her children. The idea is that people are getting saved in Jesus' ministry. So Jesus actually drank wine. I don't think that he was a drunk, but he did drink wine. John's disciples, on the other hand, they created a list that Jesus didn't talk about and the Bible didn't mention, and they judged Jesus' disciples by their standard. So write this down. John's disciples judged Jesus' disciples by a standard that Jesus didn't establish. Remember, they're all at the party. They're all at the party. Part of John the Baptist's calling was to never have a drop of alcohol, no wine whatsoever. But John never put that on his disciples. That was his calling. It never says that he put that on his disciples. John's disciples wanted to do what John did. And so they concluded that if John didn't drink wine, then no one should drink wine. So when they show up at the party, their big grievance is, hey, you're eating and you're drinking with these people. And what they're doing is they're pointing out a stark difference between the disciples of John and the disciples of Jesus. For Jesus' disciples, that was not an issue. Jesus' disciples appear to just be taking whatever is served. John's disciples, they thought that that was unspiritual, and culturally speaking, in the first century there in the Middle East, everyone drank wine. I don't think that the disciples or Jesus were doing anything inappropriate, but they were having a glass of wine. This was not an issue for the disciples of Jesus, but for the disciples of John the Baptist, this was a very big issue. So John's disciples become critical of other believers because they're not keeping a standard that Jesus never established. So as I say that, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not suggesting that if you don't drink, that you should start drinking. I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting that if you don't drink, make sure that you don't judge other people by a standard that Jesus didn't establish. Jesus and his disciples are at the party. It's John's disciples who are grumbling. So don't judge others by a standard that Jesus didn't establish. The next thing I would say is, if you're here today and you do drink, then I would say to you, ask yourself a question. Are you drinking more now than you were 3 to 5 years ago? And if you are, you should look at that. Does that make sense? So you want to look at that. Okay. So not following Jesus, we find John's disciples, they keep a dead program going. They're holding on to what God was doing, but they're going to miss what God is doing. They're critical of who God is reaching, and they're critical of how God is reaching. And they equated spiritual maturity with misery, and with their rules, they judged Jesus' disciples by a standard that Jesus never established. We would say they set a higher standard than God. And here's the result, write this down. It's not recorded that John's disciples reached anyone. Nowhere does it say that they reached anyone.